I'm Arthur. Somewhere in America tonight there is a veteran who was wounded in Iraq by a weapon of mass destruction and who then spent years under orders to keep quiet about it. The secrecy ran so deep that some of these men struggled to get proper treatment for their own burns because the nature of the wound was, officially, not to be discussed. That sentence should be impossible. The entire war, the whole vast machinery of it, was justified by exactly those weapons. And yet when American soldiers were actually hurt by chemical agents in Iraq, their government hid it, and it hid it because the truth was inconvenient in a way I promise you will understand by the end of this evening. That story is where we will finish. To get there, we have to walk the whole length of the war, and we have to read it the way historians now can, through the memos, the cables, the field reports, and the declassified files that were never meant to reach us. Ease back and let the evening go slack. This one runs long, and it earns the time. This is the Iraq War, told through what was hidden. Every war produces two records. There is the war the public is shown while it happens, the briefings and the banners and the carefully framed photographs. And then there is the war that exists on paper, in the classified memos and the internal assessments and the raw field reports, written by people who believed no outsider would ever read them. For most wars in history, the two records stay apart for 50 years or more, until the archives open and the historians move in. The Iraq War is different, and that is what makes it such an unusual story to tell. Because of leaks, lawsuits, inquiries, and one of the largest disclosures of classified material in military history, the paper record of this war forced its way into the open while the men who wrote it were still in office. So this is not an evening of speculation, and I want to be plain about that at the start. Nearly everything you are about to hear comes from official investigations, declassified intelligence files, sworn testimony, and the government's own documents. Where a number is contested, I will give you the range and tell you whose count it is. Where something remains genuinely unknown, I will say so, rather than fill the silence with a theory. I should also say what this evening is not. It is not a case that the soldiers sent to Iraq were villains. Most of what you will hear was hidden from them too, and some of them paid the highest price for the hiding. The subject tonight is the machinery above them, the offices where the paper was written, sorted, classified, and, when it became inconvenient, buried. What those documents show is not one single lie, and it would flatten the story to pretend otherwise. It is something stranger and, I think, more instructive. It is a pattern, repeated at every stage of the war, in which the people running it learned things that undercut the official story and chose, again and again, to keep those things from the public that was paying for it all. They hid doubts before the invasion, and costs during it, and bodies after it. They hid a manufactured heroin, an order about torture, a video, and hundreds of thousands of field reports. And at the very end of the chain, they hid a set of injuries so awkward for the official story that wounded soldiers were sworn to silence, which is the thread we will pull until the whole garment comes apart. Our path tonight runs in order because the concealments only make sense in sequence. First the 1980s, and a partnership nobody advertises anymore. Then the selling of the war, the memo, the tubes, the defector, and the vial. Then the war itself, the empty desert, the managed pictures, the leaked logs, and at last the secret that ties the whole evening together before we sit down with the final bill. But the beginning of this story is not 2003. To understand what the American government hid about the Iraq War, you have to start with what it hid about the Iraq it used to work with. We have to go back 20 years earlier to a photograph of a handshake. The date is the 20th of December, 1983. In a reception room in Baghdad, a trim American in a dark suit steps forward and shakes the hand of Saddam Hussein. The American is Donald Rumsfeld, sent as a special envoy by President Ronald Reagan, and there is film of the moment, polite smiles, a slight bow of heads, the easy body language of men doing business. 20 years later, almost to the season, Rumsfeld would be Secretary of Defense, directing the invasion that toppled the same man he was greeting. The handshake is famous now precisely because of that reversal. But the story around the handshake, the reason he was in Baghdad at all, stayed buried in classified files for decades, and it is the necessary first chapter of everything that follows. In 1980, Saddam had invaded neighboring Iran, expecting a quick victory over a country still convulsing from its revolution. He did not get one. The war bogged down into something out of the First World War, trench lines and artillery and human waves, and it would grind on for 8 years and consume somewhere around 1 million lives on the two sides, with estimates varying widely because neither regime counted honestly. Washington watched this with cold arithmetic. Revolutionary Iran, which had held 52 Americans hostage for more than a year, was seen as the greater danger, and the prospect of an Iranian victory was judged intolerable. So the United States began, quietly, to tilt toward Baghdad, and Rumsfeld's mission that December was part of the tilt, an offer of warmer relations with a regime Washington itself considered brutal. The relationship that grew from it was never a secret alliance in the storybook sense. It was more practical than that, and the practical details are the point. Iraq was removed from the American list of state sponsors of terrorism, clearing the way for trade, and full diplomatic relations were restored in 1984. Then came the flow, credit and agricultural financing worth billions across the decade, export licenses for sensitive equipment, the dual-use kind that can serve a tractor factory or a weapons plant depending on who signs the receipt, and intelligence, which would prove more valuable than all the rest of it combined. The true scale of that trade stayed out of view until long after the guns went quiet, and it took the government's own investigators to drag it out. In 1994, a United States Senate committee chaired by Senator Donald Regal published the results of its digging into what America had sold Iraq, and the findings still have the power to stop you mid-sentence. Between 1985 and 1990, the executive branch approved 771 separate export licenses for dual-use technology to Iraq, and it went beyond machinery. The committee documented that American companies, under licenses approved by the government, had legally shipped biological research materials to Iraq during those years, including live, reproducing cultures of the germ that causes anthrax. Those exported strains, the report noted in language that needs no dressing up from me, were later found to be identical to organisms United Nations inspectors pulled out of Iraq's biological weapons program. Here is what the public record now shows, and I want to be careful and specific because this part was denied for years. By 1983, American intelligence knew that Iraq was using chemical weapons against Iranian forces, almost daily in some periods. The State Department knew it and briefed Rumsfeld about it before his trip. The handshake happened anyway, and so did everything that came after it. There was even a public performance of disapproval, and it is worth pausing on, because you will recognize the shape of it all evening. In March of 1984, Washington formally condemned Iraq's use of chemical weapons on the record for the cameras. That same season, the envoys kept traveling, the trade kept flowing, and the relationship kept warming. The condemnation was for the audience, the policy was for Baghdad, The proof sat in classified files for a generation. Central Intelligence Agency documents from the period, declassified years, later and first published by the magazine Foreign Policy in 2013, laid the record out in plain bureaucratic language. American analysts tracked Iraq's chemical attacks as they happened, reported them up the chain, and watched the cooperation continue. And in the war's final year, the cooperation deepened into something darker. In early 1988, the United States was providing Iraq with battlefield intelligence, satellite imagery, maps, information on Iranian troop concentrations to help Baghdad blunt Iranian offensives. The analysts supplying that information understood how the Iraqi army broke Iranian formations because they had been documenting it for 5 years. I have spent a long time with the documents from this period, and what refuses to leave me is their tone. There is no hand-wringing in them, no sense of a line being crossed. Chemical warfare appears in the reporting the way weather does, as a condition of the battlefield to be noted and worked around. Then came Halabja. On the 16th of March 1988, Iraqi aircraft attacked the Kurdish town of Halabja in northern Iraq with poison gas. The town was full of civilians, swollen with families who had nowhere else to go in a war zone, and the attack came in waves, through an afternoon and into the evening. The gas was heavier than air. It settled into cellars and low streets, the places people run when aircraft appear, and it made the safest instincts fatal. Estimates of the dead run from 3,200, the minimum a Kurdish researcher could verify name by name, to 5,000, the figure the American State Department itself later used, with thousands more injured and scarred for life. It remains the deadliest chemical attack on a civilian population in history. It was carried out by a government the United States was actively assisting, with weapons programs the West had watched develop for years, and the American response, in the weeks that followed, is one of the most quietly damning episodes in this whole story.
There was no break with Baghdad.
Instead, suggestions began to surface from American sources that Iran, not Iraq, might have been responsible for most of the deaths at Halabja, a theory pushed hard enough that it muddied the world's understanding of the massacre for years. Historians who have examined that claim have found it does not hold together, and it is now widely accepted that Iraqi forces alone gassed Halabja. The fog around it was not an accident of confusion. It was useful, and it was allowed to spread. And Halabja was one day of something larger. It fell in the middle of the Anfal campaign, Baghdad's systematic destruction of Kurdish villages in that same year, in which, by the estimate of the human rights investigators who later exhumed the record, somewhere between 50,000 and 100,000 Kurds were killed. The partnership in Washington survived that too. Hold on to Halabja, because it comes back. 15 years later, American officials would invoke that same massacre, gassed his own people, as one of the moral centerpieces of the case for invading Iraq. What they would not mention is what their own government knew at the time it happened, and how it responded, and that the files proving all of this were sitting in Langley, classified, while the speeches were being written. The Iran-Iraq War ended in 1988 in exhausted stalemate. 2 years later, Saddam invaded Kuwait. The old partnership collapsed overnight, and an American-led coalition threw his army out of Kuwait in the Gulf War of 1991. As part of the ceasefire, Iraq was ordered to destroy its weapons of mass destruction under international supervision. What followed was a strange decade, and you need its outline to understand 2003. United Nations inspectors spent years inside Iraq, cataloging and demolishing the machinery of the old programs, while sanctions ground the country down and Saddam alternated between grudging cooperation and theatrical obstruction. The inspectors left in 1998 on the eve of an American bombing campaign, and for the next 4 years there were no eyes inside the country at all. Into that darkness, any fear could be projected, and in time, every fear was. And here is a fact worth holding in your pocket for the next hour, one confirmed only years later by American investigators. Iraq did, in fact, destroy the great bulk of those weapons in 1991, much of it secretly and without keeping the records to prove it. That missing paperwork, the gap between what was destroyed and what could be documented, became the space in which the next war would be built. Because 12 years later, some of the same men from that reception room in Baghdad would need a case for war, and the case they chose was the arsenal they once shook hands beside. By the end of this chapter, you will have heard the single most important sentence in the entire pre-war record, and it was not spoken by an American. It was written down in London, in a memo stamped secret and strictly personal, by a young civil servant who had no idea he was drafting the war's obituary in advance. But we have to set the stage first. On the 11th of September, 2001, Al-Qaeda killed nearly 3,000 people on American soil. Iraq had nothing to do with the operation, and no serious investigation has ever found otherwise. Yet within the administration of President George W. Bush there were senior figures who had argued for years that Saddam Hussein was unfinished business. After the towers fell, their argument suddenly had an audience, and a country in shock was in no mood to parse the difference between one enemy and another. Polls through the war's first years found large numbers of Americans believing Saddam was personally involved in the attacks, a belief no official was ever in a hurry to correct. Through 2002, in public, the administration insisted that no decision had been made about Iraq. War, the president said repeatedly, was a last resort. That was the public record. The paper record says something else. On the 23rd of July, 2002, 8 months before the invasion, Prime Minister Tony Blair gathered his innermost circle at 10 Downing Street. Around the table sat his Foreign Secretary, his Defense Secretary, his Attorney General, and the heads of his intelligence services. A foreign policy aide named Matthew Rycroft took the minutes, and those minutes are the document history now calls the Downing Street Memo. The head of MI6, Britain's Foreign Intelligence Service, had just returned from meetings in Washington, and the memo records his report to the room. There had been, he said, a perceptible shift. Military action was now seen as inevitable. President Bush wanted to remove Saddam through war, justified by the conjunction of terrorism and weapons of mass destruction. And then comes the sentence. But the intelligence and facts, the memo records him saying, were being fixed around the policy. Fixed around the policy. Not gathered, not weighed, not followed wherever they might lead. Fixed around a decision that had already been made. The same memo notes, in passing, that the case was thin, that Saddam was not threatening his neighbors, and that his weapons capability was less than that of several other states. Remember, this is not the assessment of war protesters. This is the private judgment of the British government, the war's most important ally. 8 months before the first bomb fell, while both governments were assuring their publics that nothing had been decided. The memo stayed secret for nearly 3 years. It surfaced on the 1st of May, 2005, in the Sunday Times of London, after the invasion it foreshadowed had already curdled. Had it appeared when it was written, it is fair to wonder whether the war could have been sold at all. 5 days after that Downing Street meeting, on the 28th of July, 2002, the Prime Minister sat down and wrote a private note to the President of the United States. It opened with 5 words: "I will be with you, whatever." That note stayed secret for 14 years until a British inquiry published it, and we will come back to what that inquiry concluded at the end of the evening. The public campaign opened a month later. On the 26th of August, 2002, the Vice President stood before a national convention of veterans and stripped every trace of doubt out of the official voice. Simply stated, Dick Cheney told the hall, "There is no doubt that Saddam Hussein now has weapons of mass destruction. No doubt that he is amassing them to use against our friends, our allies, and us." Hold that phrase, "no doubt," against everything you are about to hear, because doubt was precisely what the classified files were full of. No doubt was not a description of the intelligence. It was a decision about how to talk. London matched the performance a month later, publishing an intelligence dossier for the public that presented Iraq's capabilities as established fact, down to a claim that some chemical weapons could be readied within 45 minutes of an order. The 45-minute line led newspaper front pages across Britain. Years later, the official inquiry would conclude, in its careful way, that the dossier's judgments had been presented with a certainty that was not justified, which is the polite form of everything this chapter is about, because selling is the correct word, and the sellers themselves used it. When the campaign to persuade the public began in earnest in September of 2002, the White House Chief of Staff explained the timing to a reporter with a phrase from the advertising business, saying that from a marketing point of view, you do not roll out new products in August. The product was a war, and the rollout that September was a masterpiece of its kind. Consider 1 week of it. Iraq, the story went, was buying tens of thousands of specialized aluminum tubes, and American officials had concluded they were parts for centrifuges to enrich uranium for an atomic bomb. On the 8th of September 2002, that claim ran on the front page of the New York Times, attributed to anonymous administration officials, under a headline about Saddam's hunt for bomb parts. That same Sunday morning, senior administration officials appeared on the television news programs and pointed to the story as evidence, a story their own colleagues had planted. The vice president cited the morning's New York Times on national television, and the national security advisor, Condoleezza Rice, delivered the line the campaign is remembered by, that there would always be some uncertainty about how quickly Saddam could acquire a nuclear weapon, but we don't want the smoking gun to be a mushroom cloud. Here is what the public was not told that morning. The government's own leading centrifuge experts, the specialists at the Department of Energy whose entire career was uranium enrichment, had examined those tubes and concluded they were wrong for centrifuges. Wrong length, wrong diameter, wrong material specification. What the tubes did match, almost exactly, were the dimensions of a conventional artillery rocket that Iraq had been building for years. The State Department's Intelligence Bureau agreed with the doubters. So did the International Atomic Energy Agency. Those dissents were recorded inside the classified intelligence estimate that October, in the fine print, where the public could not see them. The mushroom cloud stayed on television. The footnotes stayed secret. After the invasion, inspectors settled the question. The tubes were for rockets, exactly as the Energy Department had said. There was no centrifuge program to put them in, and it was not only the evidence being managed that autumn, it was the price tag. In mid-September 2002, the president's own chief economic advisor, Lawrence Lindsay, told the Wall Street Journal that a war in Iraq might cost between $100 and $200 billion. The administration's reaction was swift and public. The budget director dismissed the estimate as very, very high, and the Pentagon's leadership insisted the true figure would come in under $50 billion. By December, Lindsay was out of his job, swept away in a shake-up of the economic team, and Washington understood the lesson perfectly. The war had an approved storyline, and the storyline extended even to the arithmetic. Keep Lindsay's number in mind for the end of the evening, because we will meet the real bill, and his career-ending estimate will turn out to have been too small by a factor of 10. In 2002, Congress voted to authorize the use of force. The classified national intelligence estimate that supposedly justified the vote ran to 92 pages, and every member was entitled to read it, dissents, footnotes, and all. By later accounting, no more than 6 senators did. One of the few who read the whole document, the chairman of the Intelligence Committee himself, came out of the reading room and voted against the war. 2 months later, in December, came a scene we know from the accounts participants gave the journalist Bob Woodward. The president watched the intelligence agency's best presentation of the weapons evidence and asked, in effect, whether that was really all they had. The director of Central Intelligence, George Tenet, reassured him with a phrase that has chased him ever since, calling the case a slam dunk. Tenet later insisted the words were about how to present the case to the public rather than the strength of the evidence, and you may decide for yourself which version is worse. The machine was nearly ready, but a case this large still needed a star witness, somebody who had allegedly seen the weapons with his own eyes. The United States had exactly one such man. He was living in Germany. He had never spoken to a single American intelligence officer, and his own handlers could not verify a word he said. His code name was Curveball. In 1999, a young Iraqi chemical engineer arrived in Germany and asked for asylum. His name was Rafid Ahmed Alwan al-Janabi, and to the German intelligence service that debriefed him, he offered something extraordinary. He claimed he had worked inside a secret Iraqi program that mounted biological weapons production on trucks, mobile germ factories, designed to brew death on the move and evade any inspector. The Germans gave him a code name, and by way of their reporting channels he became known to American intelligence as Curveball. It is hard to improve on that as an omen, though nobody read it that way at the time. His story had a seductive logic. United Nations inspectors had spent the 1990s dismantling Iraq's weapons programs and had grown confident the biological stockpiles were gone. Trucks that could move and hide explained how Saddam might have fooled them all. For analysts already convinced the weapons existed, Curveball was not a claim to be tested. He was the missing puzzle piece, and he fit exactly where the picture needed him. Notice the mechanism, because it repeats. A story that cannot be checked is not weaker in a system like this. It is stronger, because nothing inconvenient can contradict it. The tubes could be measured, and the measurements caused trouble. The trucks existed only in one man's telling, and so the trucks were perfect. But there was a problem, and it is one of the most remarkable facts of the entire pre-war period. American intelligence officers were never allowed to question Curveball directly before the war. The Germans kept custody of their source, relaying his claims second-hand, and warned that they could not confirm what he was saying. The single most important human source for the biological weapons case was a man no American analyst had looked in the eye. Inside the system, a few people did raise alarms about his reliability, and their warnings went nowhere. The doubts were not exotic. They were the ordinary, checkable kind. His claims could not be corroborated. His handlers would not vouch for him, and pieces of his account failed to line up with what inspectors knew about the sites he described. None of it mattered. When the great public case was assembled, Curveball's trucks rolled straight into it, presented not as the uncorroborated tale of an asylum seeker no American had met, but as the first-hand account of an Iraqi eyewitness, one of several sources, solid, detailed, and chilling. While Curveball supplied the germs, a set of documents supplied the atom bomb. Sometime in 2001, papers began circulating from Italian military intelligence that appeared to show Iraq negotiating to buy 500 tons of yellow cake uranium from the African nation of Niger. If genuine, they meant Saddam was shopping for the raw material of a nuclear weapon. The Central Intelligence Agency wanted the claim checked, and in February 2002, it sent a retired American ambassador named Joseph Wilson to Niger. Wilson knew the country and its uranium business, and he spent more than a week talking to officials and traders. His conclusion, delivered back to the agency, was that the sale was highly doubtful, that the consortium controlling Niger's uranium made such a diversion practically impossible to hide. Hold Wilson's name. He returns in 2 chapters, in circumstances that tell you more about how this war was defended than any speech ever could. And here is the detail that turns the uranium story from an error into something else. In October 2002, when a draft of a presidential speech in Cincinnati included the Africa uranium claim, the Director of Central Intelligence personally telephoned the White House to get it removed, and the agency followed up in writing, telling the president's aides the reporting was weak. The line was cut from the Cincinnati speech. The people around the president knew, in writing in October, that their own intelligence agency would not stand behind it. Doubt about the Niger story was not confined to one traveler or one phone call. By January 2003, analysts at the State Department's Intelligence Bureau were warning that the documents themselves were probably forgeries. And yet, on the 28th of January 2003, in the State of the Union address, the president looked into the cameras and said 16 words. The British government has learned that Saddam Hussein recently sought significant quantities of uranium from Africa. 16 words hung on the credibility of an ally, describing a purchase that his own government's experts doubted had ever been attempted, 3 months after his own intelligence director had personally pulled the same claim out of another speech. The attribution to the British was not an accident of phrasing. It let the sentence into the room without any American agency having to vouch for it, and everyone involved in drafting understood the maneuver. 6 weeks later, on the 7th of March, the International Atomic Energy Agency announced what the skeptics already suspected. The Niger documents were forgeries, and not even sophisticated ones. Specialists found the problems quickly once they were finally allowed to examine the papers. By then it barely mattered. The invasion was 13 days away. That summer, under pressure, the White House would concede that the 16 words should never have been included in the speech, a rare and carefully worded admission that the most watched address in American public life had carried a claim its own experts did not believe. And Curveball, after the invasion, investigators tore his story apart. The trucks did not exist, and the facility he described did not match reality. The weapons inspector's final report concluded his claims were false, and years later the man himself stopped pretending. In February 2011, Al-Janabi admitted to the Guardian newspaper that he had lied. He said he had watched, stunned, as his invented trucks were presented to the world as a reason for war, and he expressed something close to pride, saying he had wanted Saddam gone and had been given the chance to fabricate a reason. The most consequential human source of the 21st century, by his own account, made it up. Sit with the asymmetry of that for a second. One refugee, inventing details in a series of debriefing rooms, set in motion consequences that 1,000,000 honest analysts could not have undone because the system receiving his story wanted it to be true. Fabricators are ordinary. Every intelligence service meets them weekly. What made Curveball historic was not his lie, but the appetite for it. Which brings us to the morning when all of it, the tubes, the trucks, the doubts nobody mentioned, was gathered into a single presentation and placed before the world, delivered by the one man in the administration the world was inclined to believe. On the 5th of February, 2003, the Secretary of State of the United States sat down at the horseshoe table of the United Nations Security Council with the eyes of the entire world on him. Colin Powell was, by every measure, the most trusted man in the American government. A 4-star general, a former chairman of the Joint Chiefs, a man widely seen as the administration's reluctant warrior, the one who would not lie. That reputation is why he was chosen. The White House understood that polls showed Americans trusted Powell on Iraq more than they trusted anyone else in the building. If Powell said the weapons were real, the weapons were real. For about 75 minutes, Powell made the case. He played intercepted radio chatter. He showed satellite photographs of bunkers and trucks, annotated with arrows and labels. He described, in confident detail, the mobile biological weapons laboratories, trucks and rail cars brewing anthrax, drawn from what he called first-hand accounts, and at the center of that claim, though the world did not know his name, stood Curveball, the man no American had interviewed. Powell told the council, in so many words, that he was not speculating. Every statement he was making, he said, was backed by sources, solid sources. These were not assertions, but facts and conclusions based on solid intelligence. You now know enough about the sourcing to hear that sentence the way history does. And then came the theater. Powell held up a small vial of white powder, about the size of a thumb, and reminded the room that less than a teaspoon of dry anthrax had shut down the United States Senate in 2001. Iraq, he said, could have produced tens of thousands of teaspoons and had accounted for none of it. Powell was not a careless man, and that is what makes the episode so instructive. He had spent days at Central Intelligence Agency headquarters personally scrubbing the draft, throwing out claims he found weak or sourced to thin air. What survived his scrubbing, he believed, was solid. It was not. The mobile labs came from a fabricator. The tubes he cited came with dissents he did not dwell on. Piece after piece of the presentation would collapse over the following 2 years, and Powell came to carry it like a wound. He later called the speech a blot on his record, the painful thing, he said, that he would be remembered by. There is a detail about that morning I find quietly heartbreaking. Seated directly behind Powell, visible in every camera frame, was the Director of Central Intelligence, placed where the world could see the intelligence establishment standing, behind every word. The picture was the point, a general and a spymaster vouching together, and the picture was doing the work that the evidence could not. But in February 2003, it worked. Opinion moved. Editorial pages that had wavered came aboard. The presentation did not win the Security Council. France and Germany and Russia remained opposed, but it settled the American argument, and the American argument was the one that mattered. It is worth remembering what else was true that February, because the decision was not made in the dark. United Nations inspectors had been back inside Iraq for months, visiting site after site of the coalition's own choosing, with full access, and they were not finding the arsenal. Their chief, Hans Blix, reported to the Security Council that no weapons of mass destruction had been found, only a small number of empty chemical munitions, and he asked, in substance, for more time to finish the job. The streets weighed in as well. On the 15th of February, 2003, somewhere between 6 and 10 million people marched against the coming war across as many as 60 countries in a single coordinated weekend. The crowd in Rome was recorded as the largest anti-war rally ever held. The march in London was the largest political demonstration in British history. None of it moved the timetable by a day. In mid-March, the inspectors were advised to leave Iraq for their own safety, their work unfinished, their question still open. The answer would be delivered by other means. Hunamosend. A few voices inside the government said no, while it still cost something. In London, the veteran cabinet minister Robin Cook resigned rather than support the invasion, and told the House of Commons in a resignation speech remembered to this day that Iraq probably had no weapons of mass destruction in the commonly understood sense of the term, and that the case for war was being driven by a timetable rather than by evidence. He was proven right on both counts, and it changed nothing at the time. Being right early, in this story, was never worth anything at all.
6 weeks after Powell's presentation, on the 16th of March, the Vice President went on the Sunday program Meet the Press and told the country what to expect.
My belief, Dick Cheney said, is we will in fact be greeted as liberators. Pressed on whether Americans were ready for a long, costly, bloody battle, he said it was unlikely to unfold that way, because he really did believe the Iraqi people would welcome the invasion force. On the 17th of March, the president gave Saddam and his sons 48 hours to leave Iraq, an ultimatum designed to be refused. On the 20th of March, 2003, Baghdad time, the bombs began to fall. The military campaign itself was fast, 3 weeks from the border to the capital. On the 9th of April, the world watched a statue of Saddam pulled down in a Baghdad square, and for a moment the prophecy of liberation seemed, on television at least, to be coming true. What came next did not make the highlight reels. Baghdad dissolved into looting, ministries and hospitals, and the National Museum stripped while soldiers stood by without orders to intervene, and the state that was supposed to be inherited simply ceased to exist. Asked about the chaos, the Secretary of Defense offered a shrug that became infamous, saying that stuff happens and that freedom is untidy. Then, in May, 2 American signatures did more damage than the looters ever managed. The newly arrived administrator of occupied Iraq, Paul Bremer, issued 2 orders in his first days, the first purging members of Saddam's Ba'ath Party from public life, the second dissolving the entire Iraqi army and security apparatus. At a stroke, several 100,000 trained, armed, suddenly unpaid men were sent home into a humiliated country. The bitter detail is that American aircraft had dropped leaflets during the invasion suggesting that soldiers who declined to fight would have a place in the new Iraq, and more than 130,000 had already registered to come back when the order made liars of the leaflets. Historians now rank those 2 documents among the most catastrophic administrative decisions in modern American history. The insurgency that would consume the next 8 years recruited heavily from the men they created. On the 1st of May, 2003, the president flew out to an aircraft carrier off the California coast, emerged in a flight suit, and spoke beneath a giant banner reading "Mission Accomplished." Major combat operations in Iraq, he announced, have ended. Around 140 Americans had died in the war to that point. More than 96% of the Americans who would die in it were still alive. The country had been taken. Now all that remained was to find the weapons the whole enterprise had been built on. Special teams were already racing from site to site with maps of suspected stockpiles, and their reports were flowing back to Washington. Those reports are where the second half of this story begins, because the teams were finding something all right. It just was not what the speeches had promised, and the gap between the two became the most closely managed secret of the occupation. The weapons hunt began with genuine urgency. Military units drove through the war with lists of suspect sites, hundreds of them, ranked by priority. Then came the Iraq Survey Group, a dedicated organization of well over 1,000 inspectors, analysts, translators, and special forces soldiers, with its own aircraft and bases, charged with finding the arsenal. Site by site, the lists came up empty. Chemical plants turned out to make pesticides, or nothing at all. The feared stockpiles were rusted shells from the 1980s, or drums of ordinary chemicals, or rumors that dissolved on inspection. Week after week, the most heavily resourced scavenger hunt in history kept returning the same result. There was even a false dawn, and it is a small masterpiece of how this machine ran. In May 2003, troops in northern Iraq found 2 odd trailers fitted with tanks and compressors, and the intelligence agencies declared them mobile biological weapons laboratories, Curveball's trucks made real. On the 29th of May, the president said it plainly in a television interview. "We found the weapons of mass destruction." Here is what the public did not know. 2 days earlier, on the 27th of May, a Pentagon-sponsored team of experts who had actually examined the trailers had transmitted its unanimous conclusion to Washington that the trailers had nothing to do with biological weapons. The considered judgment of later investigation is that they most likely made hydrogen for weather balloons. The field report saying so was in the building when the president spoke, and the claim was allowed to stand for months anyway. Inside the White House, the public line otherwise held firm through the summer of 2003. The weapons would be found, officials repeated. Iraq was the size of California. Patience. The man running the search, a veteran inspector named David Kay, believed it too at first. By January 2004, Kay had seen enough. He resigned, and then he sat before a Senate committee and said the sentence Washington least wanted spoken aloud. "It turns out we were all wrong, probably, in my judgment," he told the senators, "and that is most disturbing." 2 months after that testimony, the president attended the annual black tie dinner of the Washington Press Corps and performed a comedy routine with a slideshow. The slides showed him searching the Oval Office, peering under the furniture, while he joked that those weapons of mass destruction have got to be here somewhere. The room, a room full of journalists, laughed. Asked about the routine, the father of a soldier killed in Iraq offered a one-word review: disgraceful, and I have never found a reason to lengthen it. His successor, Charles Duelfer, spent another 9 months completing the autopsy. The Duelfer report, presented to Congress on the 6th of October 2004, was roughly 1,000 pages, and its findings can be put in 3 sentences. Iraq had destroyed its chemical and biological stockpiles back in 1991. Its nuclear program had not merely stopped, it had decayed. There were no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, and there had been none for over a decade. The report added a detail that reads, in hindsight, like dark comedy. Saddam had deliberately cultivated ambiguity about his arsenal, in part because he feared looking weak before Iran, the neighbor he had gassed. The bluff that deterred Tehran is part of what doomed him in Washington. He had, in a sense, hidden weapons that did not exist, and the United States had gone to war to find them. A presidential commission delivered the epitaph the following spring. in March 2005, concluding that the intelligence community had been dead wrong. Its phrase, in almost all of its judgments about Iraq's weapons before the war. Note carefully what that verdict covers and what it does not. It describes the analysts who got the picture wrong. It stays silent about the officials who took a wrong picture, stripped away its recorded doubts, and presented it to the public as certainty, which is the part this evening has been documenting. The language of denial simply changed subjects. In June 2003, as attacks on American troops multiplied, the Secretary of Defense dismissed the enemy as pockets of dead-enders, remnants of the old regime, and compared the violence to ordinary crime in a large American city. British military officials at around that time were privately estimating 40 to 50,000 insurgents in the field. 2 years further on, in May 2005, the vice president assured an interviewer that the insurgency was in its last throes, in one of the deadliest years of the entire war. The reality underneath those phrases was a country coming apart. Car bombs in markets, assassinations of the new state's policemen and professors, entire cities fought over twice, and, after the bombing of a great Shia shrine in 2006, a sectarian bloodletting that turned Baghdad's neighborhoods into sorting machines for the living and the dead. That is what dead-enders and last throws were describing. Keep those two phrases beside the morgue photographs of those years, and you have the whole method of this war's salesmanship in a single frame, and the men who spoke them paid nothing for being wrong. That is worth saying plainly, not as outrage but as a fact about how the system worked. Being wrong in the optimistic direction was, in this war, the safest career move available. Now, a government can be wrong. Intelligence is a fog. Sources lie, as Curveball proves, and honest people misread thin evidence. If the story ended with an embarrassed administration correcting the record, this would be a story about failure, not concealment. What happened instead is why this chapter belongs in this particular evening. Remember Joseph Wilson, the ambassador sent to Niger, who reported the uranium story was probably nonsense. In July 2003, watching the 16 words survive unchallenged, he went public. His article in the New York Times, titled "What I Didn't Find in Africa," said plainly that if his findings were ignored because they did not fit, then a legitimate argument could be made that the country went to war under false pretenses. The response from the government was not a rebuttal. 8 days later, a syndicated columnist, citing 2 administration officials, revealed that Wilson's wife, Valerie Plame, was a Central Intelligence Agency operative. Her career in intelligence, built over 2 decades, much of it undercover, was destroyed in a single newspaper column, and every foreign contact who had ever trusted her was suddenly exposed to suspicion. Deliberately revealing a covert officer's identity can be a federal crime, and the leak triggered a criminal investigation that reached into the White House itself. It ended with the Vice President's Chief of Staff, Louis Scooter Libby, convicted in March 2007 of obstruction of justice, perjury, and lying to investigators, one of the highest-ranking White House officials convicted in decades. He was sentenced to 30 months in prison and a $250,000 fine. He served not 1 day. The president commuted the prison term that summer, calling it excessive, and a decade later, a different president wiped the conviction away entirely with a full pardon. The one criminal case to come out of the selling of the war ended with the punishment erased. And what of the selling itself? The Senate Intelligence Committee spent years on that question, over the administration's resistance, and in June 2008, its bipartisan verdict landed. The administration, the committee chairman summarized, repeatedly presented intelligence as fact when in reality it was unsubstantiated, contradicted, or even non-existent, and as a result the American people were led to believe the threat from Iraq was much greater than actually existed. Statements that Iraq and Al-Qaeda were partners, the report found, were not substantiated by the intelligence. Claims that Saddam was prepared to hand weapons to terrorists for attacks on America were contradicted by the intelligence available at the time. That is the United States Senate reviewing the classified record, describing how the country was talked into a war. We are now at the halfway mark of this story, and if these long, carefully documented evenings are the kind of history you want more of, this is my one pause to say that subscribing keeps the lights on and the stories long, and it takes only a moment. Now we should get back to Iraq itself, because while Washington argued over empty deserts, the war had become something no press release could contain. The government's answer to that problem was not to change the war, it was to change what you were allowed to see of it. And the first thing you were shown was a 19-year-old supply clerk from West Virginia. On the 23rd of March, 2003, in the first days of the invasion, an American maintenance convoy took a wrong turn near the city of Nasiriyah and drove into an ambush. Among the soldiers was Private First Class Jessica Lynch, 19 years old, a supply clerk from a small town in West Virginia. Her vehicle crashed. She was knocked unconscious and gravely injured, and she woke up a prisoner in an Iraqi hospital. 11 soldiers of her unit died in that ambush. What happened to their memory over the following weeks is one of the clearest windows we have into how this war was packaged. On the 1st of April, American Special Operations Forces raided the hospital and carried Lynch out on a stretcher. The raid was filmed by a military camera crew, and an edited video was handed to the world's press within hours. It arrived at the perfect moment, in a week when the advance had stalled and the coverage had turned anxious, and it played everywhere, on every network, endlessly. Then came the details, supplied by unnamed officials to eager reporters. Lynch, the story went, had fought like a lion, firing until her ammunition ran out. She had been shot and stabbed and kept fighting. She was Rambo in a ponytail, the perfect heroine at the perfect time, and America fell in love with her. The machinery of that spring made the story almost impossible to check. Hundreds of journalists were traveling embedded with military units, dependent on them for access, transport, and safety, and the reporters who received the Lynch details were quoting officials they could not name, describing intelligence they could not see. The story ran on front pages within days. The corrections took months, and corrections never chase a legend at the same speed. Almost none of it was true. Her rifle had jammed in the chaos. She never fired a shot. She had not been shot and not been stabbed. Her injuries came from the vehicle crash, and the Iraqi hospital staff had not brutalized her. By her own account, they had treated her as well as they could, and the rescue met no resistance at all. Lynch herself, to her lasting credit, refused the script. In 2007, before a congressional committee, she said the military had cast her as a Rambo from the hills of West Virginia, when the truth was painful enough on its own, and that she remained confused, her word, as to why the people in charge chose to invent a legend rather than honor what had actually happened. The bravest thing in the whole affair may be a private, refusing her own myth in front of Congress. She did not testify alone that day. The same hearing examined how the Army had handled the death of Pat Tillman, the professional football player turned ranger, killed in Afghanistan by fire from his own side, a fact his family was allowed to learn only after the funeral, after the posthumous medal, After weeks of a heroic combat narrative that officers up the chain knew to be false, different war, same workshop, and the committee treated the two cases as what they were, a pattern. The Lynch story was manufactured. Other stories were simply removed, and the clearest example is also the quietest. Since 1991, a Pentagon rule had banned photographers from Dover Air Force Base in Delaware, where America's war dead come home, and under this administration the rule was enforced without exception. Think about what that means across a long war. Thousands of flag-draped coffins came down those ramps over the years, and the American public saw essentially none of them. Each family grieved alone, and the accumulating cost of the war never had a public image to attach itself to. Officials framed the ban as protecting family privacy. Critics noted that it also protected something else. The rule had teeth, and in April 2004, the country got to watch it bite. A cargo worker in Kuwait named Tammy Silicio photographed the hold of a transport plane filled with more than 20 flag-draped coffins, each one tended with visible care, and the Seattle Times ran the picture on its front page. Many readers found the image reverent, even comforting. Silicio was fired within days, and nobody handling war freight needed the policy explained to them again. The ban itself stayed until 2009, when a new administration lifted it and let each family decide for itself. And then there is the machinery you were never supposed to detect at all. And honestly, of everything in this chapter, it is the piece I find hardest to forgive. If you watched cable news in those years, you saw them constantly. The retired generals and colonels, introduced as independent military analysts, calmly explaining that the war was going better than the papers said. In April 2008, the New York Times published the result of a long legal fight that had pried more than 8,000 pages of internal documents out of the Pentagon. The documents showed that since 2002, the Defense Department had been running a program to recruit, brief, and choreograph those television analysts, dozens of them. It flew them on trips, fed them talking points, granted access to those who performed, and privately referred to them as message force multipliers. The choreography, the documents showed, was explicit and transactional. The analysts were courted with private briefings from the defense secretary himself and escorted trips to Iraq, and the ones whose commentary strayed off message found the access, and with it their value as experts, drying up. Many of them also had business ties to defense contractors with billions riding on the war, ties the viewing public was never told about, while it took their word for how things were going. The reporting won the Pulitzer Prize. The television networks whose airtime had carried the program covered the revelation barely at all, which tells its own small story about how these arrangements survive. One more entry belongs in this chapter because it shows the machine working even at the level of a single weapon. In November 2004, American forces stormed the insurgent-held city of Fallujah in the war's most ferocious urban battle. Reports soon surfaced that white phosphorus, a chemical that burns at terrible temperatures and is very difficult to extinguish, had been used against people, not just for illumination. The official response was a flat denial. White phosphorus, the government stated, had been used very sparingly, for illumination purposes only. That denial held for a year, until an Italian television documentary forced the issue back into the open, and in November 2005, the Pentagon reversed itself and admitted the substance had been fired at enemy fighters as an incendiary weapon. Military writing from the period described the technique with a nickname, shake and bake. Temilidwing Depashain. Step back and look at the four pieces of this chapter together. because the craft is easier to see at a distance. A story the public would love was manufactured and fed to it, while an image the public might flinch from was banned. The experts explaining the war on television were secretly part of the choreography, and a weapon's use was denied until a foreign documentary made the denial unsustainable. None of this required a conspiracy in a smoky room. It required only a large institution acting on its interests, one press office at a time. Each of these was managed, and each eventually surfaced years late through a lawsuit or a hearing or a stubborn journalist. But the war was also keeping its own record of itself, minute by minute, in a database, and in 2010 that record walked out the door. We have to begin this chapter in a prison west of Baghdad, and I will tell you now that I am going to handle it soberly, because what happened there needs no dramatizing. The prison was called Abu Ghraib. Under Saddam it had been a place of torture and execution, and after the invasion the American military filled it with thousands of Iraqi detainees. The Red Cross, in the confidential report you will hear about in a moment, recorded coalition intelligence officers themselves estimating that somewhere between 70 and 90% of those swept into custody in Iraq had been arrested by mistake. In the last months of 2003, on the night shift of one cell block, American guards began abusing prisoners, and they photographed themselves doing it. A man hooded and wired, made to stand on a box and told he would be electrocuted if he fell. Men stripped and stacked and degraded while their guards posed and grinned. I will not inventory it further. The pattern was cruelty as entertainment, recorded like vacation snapshots. In January 2004, a soldier with a conscience passed a disc of the images to Army investigators, and the military opened an inquiry it did not announce to anyone. An internal report by Major General Antonio Taguba, finished that winter, found what he called sadistic, blatant, and wanton criminal abuses, systemic and intentional. The report was classified. The photographs stayed sealed. The public knew nothing, and the Army's own files were not the only warning in the building. The International Committee of the Red Cross had delivered a confidential report to coalition authorities in February 2004, documenting what it called serious violations of international law in the treatment of Iraqi detainees, describing conduct stretching back to the first spring of the occupation. That report, too, stayed inside the system, exactly as confidential reports are permitted to do, which is precisely why the system prefers them. The story broke only when the pictures escaped. In April 2004, the CBS network obtained them and then held the broadcast for 2 weeks at the personal request of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The photographs finally aired on the 28th of April, largely because the reporter Seymour Hersh was about to publish them in a magazine anyway, and the images went around the planet in a day. They did more damage to America's standing in the region than any battlefield defeat of the war. Accountability, when it came, traveled downhill only. A handful of low-ranking soldiers went to prison. The guards' commanders and the policymakers above them faced reprimands, reassignments, or nothing. And the deeper question, what interrogation policies had created that cell block, was folded into classified annexes and never fully answered in public. But here is the part of the detention story that stayed hidden longest, and it is worse than the photographs in its way. In June 2004, 2 months after Abu Ghraib broke, coalition headquarters issued a fragmentary order, military shorthand, Frago 242. It instructed troops that abuse of detainees by Iraqi forces, Iraqis torturing Iraqis, was not to be investigated unless coalition personnel were directly involved. American and British soldiers kept encountering the results. Prisoners of the new Iraqi security services beaten, burned, and worse. And they did what soldiers do. They wrote reports. More than 1,000 such reports piled up over the following years. Under the order, report after report was filed and closed. No investigation required, and none of it was public. The country that had invaded, in part, in the name of Saddam's torture chambers had issued a standing order to look away from the new ones. The same years produced the war's darkest small unit crime, and the record of how it was first described belongs in this chapter. On the 19th of November, 2005, in the town of Haditha, a roadside bomb killed a young Marine, and in the hours that followed, members of his squad killed 24 Iraqi civilians in nearby houses and vehicles, among them women, children, and elderly men. The first official account said the civilians had died in the bomb blast and a subsequent firefight. That account stood until journalists, working from survivors and local records, pulled it apart months later, and the military's own investigations then confirmed the killings. 8 Marines were eventually charged. Case by case, the prosecutions collapsed, and in the end the squad leader pleaded guilty to a single count of negligent dereliction of duty in 2012 and served no time at all. In Iraq, the verdict was received as a plain statement of what an Iraqi life weighed in an American courtroom. We know about Frago 242 for one reason. On the 22nd of October, 2010, the website WikiLeaks, working with newspapers on 3 continents, published 391,000 classified American field reports from Iraq, the largest leak in the military history of the United States. They are known as the Iraq War Logs, and they are the war's diary, written by the war itself. Understand what kind of document a war log is, because it is the opposite of a press release. These are terse, time-stamped entries typed by soldiers and duty officers in the minutes after events, full of grid coordinates and abbreviations, written for the file and not for any audience. Nobody composing them imagined a public. That is exactly why, taken together, they are the most honest account of the Iraq War that exists. The logs settled, among many things, a question the government had always waved away, the question of the dead. Officials had long insisted they kept no tally of Iraqi civilian deaths. The logs showed otherwise. The military's own reports recorded roughly 109,000 violent deaths between 2004 and 2009, and 66,081 of them were logged as civilians. Researchers combing the files found some 15,000 civilian deaths that had never been publicly known anywhere. The same files carried the paper trail of Frago 242 in action. Hundreds of reports of abuse, rape, torture, and murder by Iraqi forces working alongside the coalition, filed, stamped, and closed without investigation. Read in bulk, the newspapers that partnered on the release concluded. The logs described a war far dirtier and far more careless with civilian life than the one that had been briefed from podiums for 7 years. No official had lied about any single log entry. The lie was the silence over all of them together. The same source produced one more document, and this one was a video. 6 months earlier, in April 2010, WikiLeaks had released gun camera footage from an American Apache helicopter over a Baghdad neighborhood on the 12th of July, 2007. The crew, mistaking camera equipment for weapons, opened fire on a group of men in a square. More than a dozen people died, and among them were 2 employees of the Reuters news agency, a young photographer named Namir Nur el-Din and his driver Saeed Shmeg. When a passing van stopped to carry the wounded away, the helicopter fired on it too, killing the driver and badly wounding his 2 children. Reuters had spent years formally requesting that video through legal channels and had been refused. The world saw it only because a young Army intelligence analyst named Chelsea Manning copied it, along with the logs, and sent all of it out. Reuters, it should be said, had done everything the rules allow. The agency spent about 2.5 years pursuing that video through Freedom of Information requests on behalf of 2 dead colleagues and got nowhere. The classification system did not protect a national secret, it protected an embarrassment until it could not. Manning was court-martialed and sentenced to 35 years, the longest sentence ever imposed on an American leaker. She served 7 before a departing president commuted the remainder. The men in the helicopter faced no charges, and the officials who had told the public there was no body count faced no consequence of any kind. The record had escaped anyway, and scattered through those same logs, easy to miss among 400,000 entries, ran a thin trail of reports that pointed at something else, something not even the leak could fully expose. Troops kept finding old shells and rockets that field tests flagged as chemical agents. Those reports were terse, and the follow-ups were classified, because they touched the most awkward secret the war still had left. Now we can return to the man from the beginning of the evening, the wounded veteran under orders to stay silent, because you finally have the context that makes his story believable. This chapter is about the strangest secret of the Iraq War, the one nobody saw coming. The government that could not find weapons of mass destruction spent a decade hiding the ones it found. Here is what was happening, quietly, from 2004 onward. As American and Iraqi forces spread across the country, they kept stumbling over chemical munitions, an old rocket in a roadside cache here, a buried stack of artillery shells there, warheads turned in by locals or rigged into roadside bombs by insurgents who often had no idea what was inside them. These were not the gleaming stockpiles of Powell's presentation. They were leftovers, manufactured before 1991, remnants of the 1980s arsenal Saddam had built while the West looked on, the very program we met in Chapter 2. Many were corroded, leaking, unstable, in some ways more dangerous to handle than the day they were filled. And they kept turning up, year after year, until the count reached roughly 5,000 chemical warheads, shells, and aviation bombs recovered or destroyed. Stop and sit with that number for a moment, because beyond a scattered early announcement or two, the official silence around it was nearly total. 5,000 chemical munitions in a war fought under the banner of chemical weapons, and the public was told essentially nothing. No presidential address, no running tally, not even a sober accounting at the end, just classified reports, terse log entries, and troops sworn to secrecy. Why hide what looks, at first glance, like vindication? Because it was the opposite, and everyone handling the secret understood it. The war had been sold on an active program, factories humming, fresh anthrax, mushroom clouds on the horizon. What the troops were finding proved the old story instead, a dead program from the 80s, abandoned and rotting, with a paper trail running back to the years of the handshake. Announcing these finds would not have rescued the case for war. It would have reopened the question of who helped build the arsenal in the first place. So the finds stayed classified, and the men who handled them paid the price of the silence. Soldiers sent to destroy caches were exposed to mustard agent and to sarin, burned and blistered, and then discovered that their government secrecy applied to their own bodies. Some struggled to get proper treatment, because acknowledging the injury meant acknowledging the weapon. Recognition and awards were withheld. One former sergeant put it plainly to a reporter years later, "We were absolutely told not to talk about it." The pattern in the wounded men's accounts is numbingly consistent. A team is sent to handle or destroy a cache and comes back with skin blistering and eyes burning. The medics treating them have not been briefed because the incident is classified, so the care is improvised and the records are vague, and each man assumes for years that his case was a freak event because the secrecy kept the cases from ever finding each other. Most of the finds were handled the way bomb disposal always handles horrors, quickly and locally. Caches were detonated where they lay or trucked away for destruction, entered into logs that nobody outside the compartment would read, and folded into a war that had long since moved on to other emergencies. The men doing the work understood both halves of their instructions: deal with it and do not discuss it. The strangest episode of all had a code name: Operation Avarice. Between 2005 and 2006, the Central Intelligence Agency's station in Baghdad, working with an Army intelligence battalion, secretly purchased chemical weapons on the Iraqi black market, about 400 rockets of a type called borak, filled with sarin nerve agent, bought from a shadowy Iraqi seller and quietly destroyed. The mechanics, as they later emerged, read like a spy novel written by an accountant. There was a source with access to the old rockets. There were negotiations and purchases spread across many months, and there was a running effort to keep the source selling to the Americans rather than to anyone else who might pay. It may have been the single most effective non-proliferation operation of the entire war. You were never supposed to know it happened. Think about what that sentence contains. 2 years after invading Iraq to seize weapons of mass destruction, the United States was buying weapons of mass destruction in Iraq with cash to keep them away from insurgents and classifying the whole arrangement. It was, by the accounts that finally surfaced, a sensible and even successful operation. It was also a public admission, if anyone had been allowed to hear it, that the chemical residue of the old arsenal was real, loose, and for sale, none of which fit any speech anyone had ever given. The wall finally cracked in October 2014, when the New York Times published an investigation by the reporter C.J. Chivers under the title, "The Secret Casualties of Iraq's Abandoned Chemical Weapons." Chivers had spent years finding the wounded men the system had hidden, documenting 17 American service members and 7 Iraqi police officers exposed in the incidents he could verify, and recording their accounts of enforced silence and denied care. Consider the timing of that publication, because it is not incidental. By the autumn of 2014, the extremist group that called itself the Islamic State had overrun much of the very territory where these old munitions lay, which turned an embarrassing secret into an operational danger nobody could ignore. Questions about who might now control decaying chemical stockpiles could no longer be waved off, and the men who had been silenced were at last worth listening to. Oh, the response told you everything about where the truth had been sitting. Within weeks, the Pentagon conceded that the real number was far larger, that more than 600 American troops had reported possible exposure to chemical agents in Iraq, and the Secretary of Defense ordered medical examinations and the recognition that had been withheld, in some cases for a decade. Read that sequence back slowly. The institution had the reports all along. 600 of its own people had filed them. What changed was not the information but the cost of suppressing it, and the moment a newspaper made silence more expensive than honesty, the honesty appeared within a month, fully formed, as if it had been waiting in a drawer. Which, of course, it had. In all the years I have spent reading about this war, no single document has lodged deeper in me than that one, and it is because of the shape of the thing. Soldiers were sent to war over weapons that did not exist, were wounded by weapons that did exist but did not count, and were then ordered to keep the wound itself a secret. Somewhere in that sentence, the entire logic of the war eats its own tail. And the men who gave those orders were, by then, writing memoirs about their difficult decisions. Which leaves us one final chapter, the accounting. What did all of this cost? Who paid it? And what happened to the people who hid what you have spent this evening learning? Only one government ever forced itself to answer for the war in full, and it was not the one that led the invasion. In 2009, Britain established an independent inquiry into its road to war, chaired by a retired civil servant named John Chilcott. It took evidence for 7 years, and on the 6th of July, 2016, it published its verdict across a dozen volumes. The report ran to some 2.6 million words, and its findings, written in the gray language of officialdom, are devastating anyway. Britain chose to join the invasion before peaceful options for disarmament had been exhausted. Military action at that time was not a last resort. The intelligence about Iraq's weapons was presented with a certainty that was not justified. Saddam posed no urgent threat, and the two governments had undermined the authority of the United Nations Security Council they claimed to defend. The inquiry also published the documents, and among them was the private note you heard about in Chapter 3, from the Prime Minister to the President, written in July of 2002, 8 months before the war, opening with the words, "I will be with you, whatever." The public debates, the parliamentary votes, the weapons dossiers, all of it came after that sentence was already on paper. The paper, as usual, had the true story first. The United States never held an equivalent reckoning. The Senate's 2008 report, the one that found the case for war unsubstantiated, contradicted, or non-existent, came closest, and it arrived when the men it described were already packing up their offices. No senior official was ever charged in connection with anything you have heard this evening. The one conviction, Libby's, was commuted and then pardoned into nothing. The principals wrote their memoirs, collected their speaking fees, and defended the decision on its anniversaries. The people who forced the truth out fared differently, on the whole. The analyst who leaked the logs went to prison. The whistleblowing was punished with a severity the war's architects never faced for the war. If you want a one-sentence summary of official accountability for Iraq, it is that the record-keepers paid and the decision-makers did not. One man, of course, was held fully to account, and the record should note who. Saddam Hussein was pulled from a hole in the ground in December 2003, tried by the new Iraqi state for a massacre from the 1980s, and hanged at the end of 2006 for the crimes of the dictatorship. That is something like justice. It is worth noticing that the massacre he was hanged for took place in the very years the handshake photographs were being taken, when the men in those photographs found him useful. So the accounting has to be done the way we have done it, from the record. Lawrence Lindsay, fired for estimating the war might cost $200 billion, turns out to have been the great optimist in the building. The costs of war project at Brown University puts the direct budgetary cost of the Iraq War at roughly $1.8 trillion, and once the lifetime care of its veterans is counted through 2050, the estimate rises to nearly $2.9 trillion. The careful man was off by a factor of more than 10 in the safe direction, and he was the one punished for saying a number out loud. And because the war was financed largely with borrowed money rather than taxes, the interest keeps compounding quietly in the background, a war bill that outlives the war, the researchers note, by generations. The $50 billion estimate that got Lindsay's number laughed out of the room is now a rounding error on the real ledger. Nobody was ever fired for that. The human ledger resists precision, and after an evening like this one, you can guess why. Nobody in charge wanted it kept. By the Pentagon's own count, more than 4,400 American service members died in Iraq. The Iraq Body Count Project, working from documented, cross-checked reports, has recorded between roughly 187,000 and 210,000 Iraqi civilian deaths from violence, and its keepers are the first to say the true figure is higher. Broader statistical studies of the war years run from several 100,000 dead to around 1 million, and historians will be arguing over that range for the rest of our lives. And the hidden things? Every one of them surfaced. The memo surfaced in a London newspaper, the dissents in a Senate report, the heroine's true story in her own sworn testimony. The torture order and the body counts walked out in a soldier's data files, the television generals fell out of a Freedom of Information lawsuit, and the secret casualties finally stood up, one by one, in the pages of the newspaper of record. That is the actual lesson of this evening, and it is oddly hopeful, so let me say it plainly. Governments can hide almost anything for a while, and this one hid a great deal. But paper is patient, and sworn testimony is patient, and wounded men live long enough to talk. On every single count, the concealment failed. It just failed slowly, after the elections it needed to survive, which is also the uncomfortable half of the lesson. Concealment does not have to last forever to succeed. It only has to last through the decision. Every disclosure you have heard tonight arrived after the vote it might have changed, and the men who managed the timing understood that arithmetic better than anyone. And what of Iraq itself, the place all the paper was about? The war ended there, formally in December 2011, when the last American combat convoy rolled south into Kuwait. It left behind a shattered state, millions displaced, a generation raised inside violence, and the vacuum that the Islamic State would fill within 3 years, dragging American forces partway back and adding new names to every count you just heard. For the people of Iraq, none of this evening's revelations were revelations. They did not need a leaked log to know the checkpoints were deadly, or a Senate report to know the case for the invasion had been thin. The concealment we have traced all night was aimed first and last at the public that was paying for the war, which is perhaps the strangest fact of all. The people being protected from the truth were not the enemy, they were the voters. For tonight, the files are closed, but I want to leave you with the question this whole evening has been circling. Most of you listening lived through some part of this. You saw the vial on television, or the banner on the carrier, or the photographs from the prison, and you were told at each step what they meant. Some of you were in uniform for it, or waited at home for someone who was, and if that is you, I hope tonight read to you the way it was intended, as care for the record, not contempt for the people who served it. So tell me in the comments, honestly, what you believed at the time, and when it changed for you, if it changed. Every war ends twice, once on the ground, and once in what people finally accept about it, and that second ending is written partly in places like a comment section under a long history at 2 in the morning. I read what you leave here, and it shapes where this channel goes digging next. If someone you know still argues about this war, or lived it in uniform, this is the kind of evening worth passing along to them. The next buried chapter is already on my desk. The handshake, the memo, the vial, the logs, the silence. You now carry the version of this war that took 20 years and a mountain of forced disclosures to assemble. Most people never will. I'm Arthur. Let the record rest for the night, and rest with it. Whenever the next buried chapter calls to you, you know the way back.